Cameron, welcome. Cameron is the CEO of Pickleball Insurance Program and runs an insurance agency. And he has an interesting background of coming into pickleball because they've been in the bowling industry for about 40 years, if I remember correctly. And there's a lot of parallels between the bowling industry and facilities and pickleball facilities that are starting to come in. So I've had an interesting conversation in the past with Cameron on that. But we're going to focus a lot on what pickleball facilities need to be concerned about with insurance, because there are specific things. And when I was running pickleball station about 4 or 6 years ago, it was tough to find somebody that understood what we were doing. And I know Cameron's dealt with over 100 facilities, so I'm excited to hear all about insurance and pickleball facilities. Why don't we start with somebody is looking at creating a pickleball facility and they realize, oh, I need insurance. And they go to their local insurance agent who may not really know, the ins and outs of a pickleball facility. So walk us through, what are the key areas of coverage a pickleball facility should be looking for? And then we'll dive into some more specifics.
Yeah, so this is basically my everyday. Somebody who's getting into a pickleball business, or they're trying to find a location. They've maybe got a lease in front of them, and oftentimes the first contact that they make with me is, hey, I'm applying for my SBA loan, and they say I need insurance, right? And they're at that point mostly looking for a rough order of magnitude, something to put into their pro forma. And that's going to be highly dependent on the state that they're in, the scale of the operation, what they're investing, what their revenue projections are, things like that. So we're able to do that. But a lot of times what I encounter is people come and they're in a rush, right? Because they got to have it. But getting them a quote at that point is really pointless. What usually is the next step, and this is what I coach them to track towards, is your next step is really getting to the lease, because that's when we're going to start to really define the insurance requirements, because there's multiple parties you have to satisfy beyond your own risk perspective and needs, et cetera. And that may be the landlord. If you're a franchisee, that may be the franchisor. They have certain insurance requirements, and knowing what those are going into it is really quite important, because it obviously affects the budget, and you don't want to get into a position where you've agreed, for instance, to a lease that requires something on the insurance side that's ridiculous. So, these are kind of the steps that I walk people through when they call. They're very excited. They think they have to have insurance right away. They usually don't. But we want to slow down a little bit and make a determination of what's being required of me by others. And then ultimately, what do I actually need, which is the core of your question. And the answer to that is, well, everybody needs general liability coverage. That's a basic commercial general liability policy. What often gets overlooked, and I found this to be a little bit surprising in the industry, is they also have to have property coverage. And a lot of people will tell me, no, I don't need property coverage. The landlord covers the building. Well, that's true enough. But if you're about to spend $500,000 or $1 million in making the place yours, in courts, in paint, in signage, in furnishing, et cetera, then you want to make sure that's covered. Because if you're in Houston, Texas, and a tornado comes through or a hurricane comes through and blows the roof out the landlord's building, yeah, you don't have to pay to repair the roof, but all that water is going to do some pretty bad damage to your facility. And that's a true story. That actually happened to a club in Houston. And so you want to think about it from that perspective. The landlord is not going to pay to restore or repair your stuff. That's not their problem. Right. And so you want to make sure that that's adequately covered. And that's a big oversight that I see. I've found, frankly, really successful club owners that were operating that had no property coverage. Nobody had told them that they needed it, right? So they go to their local agent, and the local agent is just, I'm listening to the customer. They tell me I only need this. Well, most of these people, it's the first time they've ever put on the chief everything officer hat, the first foray into small business. They don't know what they need. It'd be like going to your heart surgeon and telling him, hey, I think you need to go in through the belly button and come up through the chest cavity, and I think if you enter in over here, like, no, you don't know. Why would you know? You've never done it before. And so it, that partnership that takes place between an agent and a customer becomes critically important. And you want to partner with somebody, to your point, David, like that kind of knows what you're doing, right? And we still have people, less and less, that don't know what pickleball is. And so that's the dynamic that happens. And the first thing I ask them, well, how much are you spending to build the place out? Because we want to ensure that value. And then even if I talked to a guy yesterday who's taking over an existing club and the landlord now owns everything on the inside. So here's a case where he doesn't have to insure the courts. It's got these beautiful murals on the wall, like there's value associated with that, right? He doesn't have to insure any of that. So here's a unique case, and yet he still needs property coverage because he has to have loss of income coverage. What happens if the sprinkler system goes off and floods the place? Well, you know what happens? It's more like what doesn't happen. Nobody plays pickleball. So you're not making any money, right? And so the insurance will step in to pay for the continuing expenses that you have, because just because your revenue stops doesn't mean your expenses stop, right? You still have to pay me. You still have to pay insurance. You still have to pay your rent. You still have to pay your salaried employees if you want them to continue working for you. So you have to have that loss of income coverage piece. I call it really bankruptcy insurance, because without it, you'll go bankrupt. If you can't make money due to a covered claim, then this is what keeps you in business. And so these are very common oversights that I see in competitor policies, or when somebody comes to me and nobody's walked them through this. Insurance is something that is critically important. And yet, if you don't have a partner that's willing to slow you down and educate you on what it is that you need and why, then you can end up in a position where, Murphy comes knocking on the door and he's bringing a wrecking crew. And that's what insurance is designed to address, right? On the liability side, it's been absolutely shocking to me the number of policies and really, again, high-end clubs that I have seen with an exclusion for bodily injury to sporting participants. And just let that sit in your head for a little bit. It's like,
Right.
oh, that's why I bought the policy to begin with. That's the main risk. And it's just, and you go, oh, that must be a really, random carrier, but the problem is that it's not random. I've seen it over and over again, and with good carriers. And it's because they don't really want the sporting risk. You know, they'll take the slip and fall, walk around, parking lot stuff, but they don't want the sporting risk, because that is the number one claim. It's somebody getting injured playing the sport. I see assault and battery claim, or all assault and battery exclusions. I see that less often today than a year ago, but I do see those. And I mean, we all probably saw the video recently of the guy who knocked the player's handle out of his hand and then he kicked him in the neck. Like, David, I think you've heard me say this before, but we're putting highly competitive people in a small area. We're handing them a miniature hatchet, and we're asking them to hit a hard plastic object at each other's faces. Like, what could go wrong? Well, that video proves it, right? Like,
Right.
that's what this is. And so you can't go without that. So these are the things that when people come to me, I walk them through. I'm trying to educate them at every step of the way, because the devil is in the details. And if you don't know which details are important, or if you don't know which details to look for, then you can end up in these positions where your insurance puts you out of business, which I don't know if you know this, but is not why people buy it, turns out. So it's really a thing that, obviously, I mean, I'm getting excited talking about it, that I'm very passionate about. And the education piece is critical. And my advice to even people who are not going with me is, look, you have to quiz your agent. You have to challenge them, and you have to, and I do this a lot. People are like, well, what should I ask my agent if I'm challenging him, right? And the very basic one, if you really want to see if the agent has ever actually like read a policy, I say that with tongue in cheek, but you'd be surprised how many insurance agents have never read a policy. Ask them to explain how loss of income coverage works. And if they tell you, oh, it replaces your revenue, they're wrong. It's not revenue replacement. It's continuing operating expenses plus lost net profit. So that's a quick little tidbit.
Yeah.
If you want to challenge your agent, it's shocking to me how many agents don't know that answer. So anyways, That's a long question or answer to your question, but I'm glad to dive into it because this is the conversation I end up having, and that my sales team ends up having like every day with people who are coming into it for the first time. And that's that operational policy piece. There's construction policies that might be needed as they're doing the build out phase. Sometimes we'll write a very simple general liability policy when they take possession of a facility just to satisfy the landlord until they are up and running. That's an efficient way of doing it versus, writing the full up policy and you're not open for 6 months. That doesn't make sense. There's some nuances there for sure, but at the end of the day, those are some of the key areas that I've seen be problematic in other people's solutions.
I was going to ask, one of the things, I was talking to an operator recently, new facility, and he had come from another industry where he seems to think that it's completely transferable. That if I did a restaurant, therefore pickleball must be the same. Therefore, I can go with the same agent. I can do all of the same business practices, basically, that I did in business A to that. And the first one that always jumps out at me is the notion of, I asked him about liability. Just, well, the players are signing a waiver. Therefore, I am covered. And I know in all my work in the legal field that waiver a lot of times doesn't mean squat, right? And I would assume that's something you run into on your side of the fence there.
Yeah, waivers are always good. Okay, they always help you, right? But that's where a lot of this sporting injury, exclusion becomes extremely problematic because look, we all know anybody can sue for anything, right? And ultimately what insurance does really well is pay for your legal bills. Right. And if your policy excludes those sporting injury claims, even with a waiver, well, who's going to pay the attorneys to defend you and make that argument? If your policy excludes it, then you are. That's coming out of your pocket, right? So even with waivers, even if we're in a state that's like, oh, we worship at the altar of waivers, you could waive your rights to anything, assuming that existed, right? You would still have to defend yourself to enforce it. So whether the waiver is good or not, the coverage has to be done right to defend you. Now, waivers, again, it totally depends on the state and it depends on the person signing. A waiver for somebody who's 16 years or younger is mostly worthless. Some states will say, oh, you've reached an age of understanding, and so therefore the waiver is more enforceable. Some states will say, yeah, no, if it's a minor, the waiver is, you might as well throw it in the fire, like it doesn't matter. Adult waivers are a lot more enforceable, of course, but even still, you can't waive third-party liability. Well, what does that mean? You can't waive, a waiver will not protect you from an assault and battery claim because that's a third-party injury, right? A waiver will not protect you from a liquor liability claim. That's a third-party injury, okay? So the waivers are not covering all your exposures, even if they're well-written, even if they're in a state that enforces them. The waiver really is just limited to those things which can be foreseeably waived. Like foreseeability is key. Now, we might talk about the inherent risks of the sport of pickleball. There are inherent risks. People run into each other. They get hit in the face with a ball. All kinds of stuff happens, right? They run into a wall. And I don't really think you need a waiver to fight those claims. Either way, you're fighting them, okay? Whether you have a waiver or not, you're still fighting them. That's why the legal expense coverage is so critical. But at the end of the day, and we deal with this all the time in bowling, at the end of the day, it's an inherently risky activity. You're going to get injured eventually, unless you stretch, right? All the stretching fans out there saying, good, he put in a plug for stretching. Stretch. But there is inherent risk associated with it. And a lot of states, not every state, a lot of states have legal doctrines that say if you are injured due to the inherent risk of an activity that you are voluntarily engaging in that's sporting or recreationally based, then you are barred recovery. And that's called primary assumption of risk doctrine. In some states, it's subsumed into their comparative tort law systems they call it modified comparative tort or implied assumption of risk. These are things that we know inside and out because it's the only way we've been able to make the bowling class of business profitable. You have to know these nuances in the law and case law and argue them because most plaintiffs' attorneys have, the last time they heard about assumption of risk doctrine was in law school, you know. So you have to know how to speak that language and emphasize to these attorneys that you got a long way to go. You're going to do a lot of work and you're probably not going to get paid because there's only two things that an attorney, a plaintiff's attorney especially, respects: a good argument, that's how they were trained, and the quickest route to the money. They value their time. They value those two things. And on a good case especially, it's my job and it's our claims team's job to explain to them very clearly and very forcefully, all your arguments are bad and this is a waste of your time. And oh, by the way, the only people who get lied to more often than judges are plaintiffs' attorneys. So you've got customer trust issues, you've got client trust issues, and I will exploit them. So the waivers, again, use waivers, do them electronically. That's great. They're always an advantage. But no, you're not covered by a waiver.
There's a lot of details, as you mentioned earlier, where a facility might be doing something and not sure if the general policies cover it. So if I could go through a couple things and just get a quick response from you on that. Number one, alcohol.
Yeah, if you're serving alcohol, you have to have liquor liability coverage. With the exception of in the state of Wisconsin, which grants immunity, like literally the word, next time you see the word immunity in a statute, like do a little dance because it doesn't exist. But in Wisconsin, and those people that live in Wisconsin are like, yeah, this is how I was raised. Servers and liquor license holders in Wisconsin have immunity. So maybe not Wisconsin. Wyoming doesn't have a dram shop statute, but I don't know how many pickleball clubs are in Wyoming yet. The cows in Wyoming make great players. So, I insure pretty much all the bowling alleys in Wyoming. So I guess that gives me license to make Wyoming jokes.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, they have to have liquor liability coverage, and you're going to want at least $1 million per occurrence, and in most states, $2 million aggregate.
Okay. What about a more modern concern, cyber insurance? Somebody gets into your reservation system.
With how much pickleball clubs depend on online reservation systems, absolutely, I feel like cyber coverage is mandatory. It's not technically mandatory, but I feel like it's mandatory. And the thing is, it's just not expensive. Do they need $1 million in coverage? Probably not. Okay, but $500,000 in coverage for a club that does about $1 million a year might cost them $800 to $1,000 a year. Okay, the key points of the cyber coverage that they want to make sure they have are loss of income due to a cyber incident. Okay, and specifically within that, what's called contingent business income. Okay, and all that means is that, hey, I rely on a third-party software provider, a Court Reserve or a PodPlay or whatever, right? And if they get hit with a cyber attack and they shut down, I will lose money. I depend on them. My business is contingent on their business. So those are kind of the key factors: loss of income and specifically contingent business income. Otherwise, most policies do carry, ransomware attacks. They carry the privacy breach coverages. That's pretty standard. But that's the one little nuance that's very important from a practical perspective when we talk about cyber claims in pickleball clubs.
What about kids camps? You've got kids coming in and, they're going to be 20 kids learning how to play pickleball and you're going to have 2 staffers responsible for them. When my kids go to camp, 2 people have to go to the bathroom with them, if it's in the night, another kid and an adult have to go with them just to make sure, everything's kosher. Insurance wise, do you have to worry about if you're doing kids specific programs?
Most general liability policies will carry an abuse and molestation exclusion. Okay. And it's just because ever since Safe Sport, that type of claim has become very difficult and very expensive to insure. Now, usually, including with us, you can get a little add-on coverage to package into it, and it's not the full limit. But it's, it might be $100,000, it might be $500,000, something like that. from an actual risk evaluation perspective, on the abuse and molestation side, you know, background checks, if you don't do background checks, you're going to get sued if something happens. Okay. So background checks become very important. And when we're talking about staff who regularly interact with children. Okay. That said, I don't believe that a facility has an emphasis on the facility rather than, say, a team with a coach, right? Or something that involves anything that's overnight. I don't feel like facilities actually have a huge exposure to those kinds of risks. Okay. And the first reason is that they just don't, you know, they'll do a kids clinic, but it's not their, it's incidental. It's not their primary focus or primary source of revenue. So their exposure even to that situation is fairly low to begin with. Okay. The other piece of it is, again, like, we're not traveling with the kids. We're not doing, you know, we're not going into, probably not going into locker rooms with kids, right? That just the exposure is very minimal. And contrary to the news, it also doesn't, it just doesn't happen as often as people maybe think, right? So we've done bowling alleys for 40 years, okay? Bowling centers, almost 40 years, have not had these kinds of claims in a very long time. You know why? Because they eliminated their nurseries. You know, bowling used to be a place where, you know, mom stayed at home and she brought the kids to the bowling alley so that she could participate in league bowling, okay? That's how it used to be. And you had some of those claims in those days. Well, they've all eliminated their nurseries, and there's not been a claim for at least, you know, 20 years in our book, you know, for abuse and molestation. And, you know, not to throw the bowling industry shade, but if it was going to happen anywhere, I think it would probably happen at a bowling alley before it would happen at a pickleball club. You know, so I don't think the risk is that big. What I'd be more concerned about with kids, just kid injuries. You know, but the nice thing about this is weird to say, the nice thing about a kid injury is that they have a lot further, or they have a lot, they're a lot closer to the ground when they fall, you know, so they don't usually get as injured. And when kids get injured, they usually, you know, rub their elbow and continue on, right? So that even from a general liability injury perspective, that exposure is just not huge. Again, if we were going to see major claims from this, we would have seen it in bowling. Okay. In bowling, we're handing them a heavy object and asking them to walk towards a slippery alley. Like, it's just more risky.
Right. Right. Okay, great. One more. I'm starting up a facility and I'm going to go 24/7 in my facility and not have staff in the evenings. Do I need to tell you that?
Yes, you should tell me that. For us, it doesn't matter. We can cover it. There are a lot of carriers that will not cover 24-hour operations, particularly unmanned. I think as of my last look, we've got 5 of the completely unmanned facilities insured. You know, they're all remotely monitored by a team of people, and the surveillance, of course, is excellent, and it's a key in, key out type system. So we do that. That doesn't bother us because, again, we insure 24-hour bowling alleys. And the key thing there is if it's going to be unmanned, okay, then you really do want to limit it to those people that you know, okay, as best you can, right? You can have guests, obviously, but that's something that starts to trend towards the member-only feature because these are people that, one, you want them to have an investment in the facility personally, right? Like, I don't want to hurt these people, okay? The other piece of it is that, you know, you'll have a waiver on file for them. That gives us something to argue with, right? And 3, you know, these are just people that you know. You know, these are people that when I say no, you may not know them personally, but you get what I mean. There's a business relationship with these customer bases. So that's my recommendation. Obviously, that's kind of a innovative or unique business model that people are starting to test out, and we'll see what comes of it. You know, so much of this industry at this point is so very new, and so we're going to learn as we go along. But the 24/7 operation doesn't bother me. It is something you need to disclose because you don't want the insurance company, you know, coming in and saying, well, what do you mean there was nobody there? Well, we didn't sign up to cover that. Now you're getting canceled, right? So you do want to disclose that.
What do you think Cameron, is the biggest mistake that people make? I mean, I know you've just articulated a number of areas that facility operators need to be aware of, but is there one sort of that you hear more than others that is the big red flag that you want people to know about?
When it comes to insurance, I don't know that it's a mistake. I think it's a need to challenge their perspective. Okay. Um, I deal with a mentality a lot from certain, arenas or groups where they come in and they're really just looking for the cheapest thing they can possibly find. Now, I know that's self-interested just for an insurance guy who's, commission based, et cetera, to be saying that, but my encouragement, my hope is that people will zoom out a little bit and really take, I don't know, 10 seconds to dwell on what is it that insurance actually does for me? Because everybody loves to hate insurance, right? I mean, we're dealing with the assassination of a healthcare CEO, and certain groups of the market cheering that, right? So like I get it. Nobody likes insurance people. Like they belong at the bottom of the ocean with the attorneys. I do get it. But what is it that insurance actually does for you, right? And what it does, it keeps you out of bankruptcy. It literally gets you back up and running. It pays the bills so that you don't have to when there's a disaster. Okay. Well, how important is that? Well, it's life and death for your business. If your insurance has one of these exclusions that I've talked about, or there's not enough coverage, and when I say not enough coverage, that's not really about the total loss scenario, like, oh, the fire burnt the place down. That's even if you're underinsured, the carriers underpay. They will penalize your claim payouts if you underinsure, and there's a reason for that. It's not all about the price. It's about, do I partner with somebody that really knows what I need and what I don't? Can they explain it to me in a way that I understand? Okay. And are they invested in my business? I've obviously built an entire brand, an entire company around this industry. If I don't treat one customer right, everybody's going to know about it. It's a small group. And so if it's just your generalist broker that you're going and you're talking to, if they lose you, if they make you mad and you take their business away from them, that doesn't actually hurt them, right? They don't have an investment in this space. And so you have to take a step back and realize, yeah, I may not like paying for insurance and I want to pay as little as possible. And that's fine. We want to be competitive. We want to pay, competitive rates, right? But at the end of the day, that insurance has to function the way you expect it to. And so you need somebody who's going to explain and set those expectations and be blunt and be honest and straightforward about it, and has the capability and the know-how to, again, walk you through it. Not that you know every in and out, but that you at least have the confidence that, hey, this person knows what they're doing. They're able to explain to me how this works, and they're able to explain to me where the pitfalls are. And they're willing to stand their ground on it. That's somebody who cares more about protecting the customer than about their commission. And so that's the biggest thing that becomes a red flag to me is, I'll get somebody, who comes to me and they're opening a club in Florida. Right? Well, Florida premiums are at least twice as expensive as everywhere else in the country. Okay. New York, same way. Okay. Texas is also expensive because of the wind and hail risk, or more expensive. Not as much as Florida and not as much as New York, right? But they'll come to me and somebody has set the expectation that they're going to pay, 10 grand for their 12-court facility. And it's like, that's a non-starter in Florida. You're going to be higher than that in Texas. You're going to be higher than that in New York, right? And if all you're focused on is the price, then you'll get a quote and you'll jump at the price and you won't have coverage for sporting injury claims, right? And when that happens and you get denied and you're now going to get a loan to finance the legal bills, you're not going to be bragging to your friends about how little you paid for your insurance. Nobody does that, right? So it's a challenge of that perspective. And again, it's like, yeah, of course he's going to say that, but it's true. It's absolutely true. And that's the biggest thing that I would hope people would take some time to slow down a little bit and recognize, without quality insurance, without insurance that does what I expect it to do, I'm one accident away from being bankrupt, because that is the dynamic. That absolutely is the dynamic. So that's the main kind of challenge message, if you will, that I have for those that are coming into this space or those that are already in it. If the devil's in the details and you don't want to get burnt.
It's great. And Cameron, we really appreciate you coming on and educating us on that. and taking the time to educate the industry, because you're on a lot of panels, you're a speaker, you're talking about this issue, which, like you say, is not necessarily top of mind for people, but is very, very important. And we appreciate you explaining it and giving people thought. And certainly, if they are interested in pickleball facility insurance, they can get a hold of you through the Pickleball
That's correct.
Insurance
Yeah,
Program.
piprogram.com. Piprogram.
And we'll, of course, put links
Okay.
to that all over the place.
Awesome. Well, thanks again.
Great. Thank you.
Cameron, thank you.
All right,
Great to
gentlemen.
meet
Thank you. It's been
All
fun.
right. Take care.